middle of chapter Memhei 45, Ayin Beis, volume 1, page Ayin Tes 79. We're beginning of the early part of the 12th discourse, Nachmu Ami. In the last class, I gave an overview of the whole structure of the 10 spheres and 4 worlds. How they define reality. And basically, everything in existence needs to go through these. Anything that's created from a stage of, it's called from zero to a final product, has to go through 4 stages. A concept, a vision, a concept, an outline, a skeleton, the details, and then the final product. Basically, Atzilus, Beriya, Yetzirah, and Asiya. And the way this world is this way is because God structured it that way. And He too created the universe that way. He started with a vision. So Elam Ha'achdus, Atzilus, then Beriya, and Yetzirah, Asiya. I didn't mention, only alluded to, that these 4 worlds also exist on all levels of Ishtalshalos, the whole cosmic order. So we discussed in different classes, but I'll just say it here for the record. There's a thing called Atzilus the Klolos and Atzilus the Pratis in Chassidus. And this is an Alter Rebbe's Maimer that the Tzemach Tzedek explains at length in a Maimer that's called the Drush Gimel Minei Adam. Gimel Minei Adam referring to Adam Elyon and these 3 levels of Beriya, Yetzirah, Asiya. So Atzilus the Klolos generally is the Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. That's why it's called Atzilus, because Atzilus means it's not a Beriya, it's not a creation yet, it's still an emanation. So if you think of it in the context of the 4 stages, Atzilus is more the vision of the Creator of what He wants. So fundamentally, really, you don't have anything yet. All you have is an idea. So the idea is still connected to the source. It's once He puts an outline on paper, or a skeleton, let's say in a piece of architecture, then you have actually something is beginning to take shape. And then it develops further. So Atzilus, by definition, means, as the length of the discussion at length here, is Atzilus is really Gili Ahelim. Because it's revealing something that's concealed in the artist or in the creator's vision. However, what makes it Atzilus is because it's a distinct vision. It's not just Bli Gvul, everything's possible. Like we say, Sfiris Ein Ketz. That's a higher level. Here you already have the Esses Spheres Hagnuzes. So Esses Spheres Hagnuzes, as he explained, the 10 hidden spheres, there's no spheres there. They're concealed, not because, as he said, Gnuzes doesn't mean they're concealed from us, and if you were able to look deeper, you'll find them. Gnuzes means fundamentally, they're qualitatively a state that is not even defined yet. That's what he said. We only call them Esses Spheres is because it's in the mind of the Creator what He envisions is going to happen. Shir Atzmei B'Kayach. So that's Atzilus the Klolos. Beriya the Klolos, when I say Klolos meaning the macrocosm, and the big picture, is generally Adam Kadman. Yetzirah the Klolos is different opinions, but it's generally Akudim and Akudim. And Asiya the Klolos is Atzilus Beriya Yetzirah Asiya the Pratis. So that's how you have it, like a hologram. Everything exists on a small scale and also on a big scale. Then when you speak, usually, when it talks about Atzilus, Beriya, Yetzirah, Asiya, you're usually talking about the Pratis, not the Klolos. But if you think about it, the same properties, whatever you apply to Atzilus the Pratis, you could basically say to Atzilus the Klolos with an important qualification, that Atzilus the Klolos is not yet a real world. It's the image of the world, so to speak. And Atzilus the Pratis is already a real entity. I just wanted to fill that in. So in the first part of Memhei, chapter Memhei, the Rebbe Rashab is discussing that the same thing he discussed till now about Milo Mata, that the structure of Seder Shtalshul, the 10 spheres, is defined, as he said, by 2 elements of higher and lower. One is each sphere is fundamental level that's different than another. Chochmah and binah are 2 different entities, as is intellect and emotions. And the second thing is intensity of energy, the degree of energy. How much are they revealed? How much energy is there? Or put it this way, how much godliness is there? How much bittul? How much yesh, so to speak? So that is the second aspect of. She said the same thing is in the general picture of the worlds. So the structure of the worlds is also gradations of Ma'ala Mata, meaning that Beriya is a lower level than Atzilus, and that's what we've been discussing, Atzilus and Beriya. So he began explaining it with the Tikkun Zeir, says the mashal, that Atzilus is like an image, the Yukna de Malka, it's the image of the king itself. Beriya is the image as it's engraved in a chesem, in a what do we call it? Seal, right? And Yetzira is that same image as the seal makes another image in a wax, shaiva. So you have three stages, like, it doesn't mention Asiya. I didn't look it up yet in Tikkun Zeir, what it says there. But this is just a mashal. So from this we see that the spheres in each world is completely different than the other one. Do they bring the rest of the lashon from Tikkun Zeir? It's right at the beginning of the chapter. Okay, fine. So but what's the explanation of the difference? So the Rebbe Rasha begins by explaining there's a parsa that separates. A parsa, I translate it as a veil or a curtain. I think the best translation of a parsa is a word in Aramaic, which is the same word as masach in Hebrew. But in Chassidus, you'll see sometimes it says mesachim u'prasayos. There's tzimtzum, there's a concealment. A masach and a parsa are interchangeable. They can be a curtain, a veil. I think screen is the best word, to be honest. A screen. It's a screen. And then you have a mesachim parsayos. You have, what else do you have? Halom esvasterim. Mesachim parsayos. Mesachim parsa. You have a pargud. A pargud is usually a curtain. You say by ma'acheri ha-pargud. The bottom line is, there's a parsa that exists between a screen, between Atzilus and Beriya. So the Rebbe Rashav explains what is the screen. Because understanding the screen will help us understand the distinction why the Tikkun Zeir says that in Atzilus you see the image itself. And in Beriya it's the image as it's engraved in a what are they called? A seal. Okay. Chesem, fine. So he explains that parsa is like a mashal, an example. An example, when you explain a concept to someone who doesn't understand the concept in its original idiom, in its original framework and paradigm, you need an example. And the example, by definition, means that it's an example from a foreign, dover zar, something else to explain it, because you wouldn't need an example if it's the same thing. You can just explain the original concept. The example itself tells you that it's coming to bring it to another level. She's still speaking about the same concept, but the mashal itself is now already is a screen. So when you hear it through the mashal, you're a step away from the original, even though it helps you understand the original. But he's focusing now on the part that is different. In other words, the chiddush here is that it's different. The fact that it's part of the original is obvious. If the mashal is not coming to explain the original idea, it's not a good mashal. Here he's explaining how a mashal is so-called different than the nimshal. So it's a screen. And the word he uses, which I'm sure is a word from the Alter Rebbe, because the way he's medayik in it, he says that what is a parsa? The parsa, like the mashal, is like this. The language he used, which is a very interesting expression. I lost it. Oh. So that's the parsa, because he repeats that 3 times. Yeah, you're speaking in an inyan acher, in a different idiom, in a different paradigm, shalem inyan Atzilus. So the parsa, the mashal, so to speak, the screen between Atzilus and Beriya is causing the language to change, and the framework to change, and the paradigm to change. You're talking about something else that's not the inyan of Atzilus. To understand Atzilus, but it's not Atzilus itself. So in the example, basically, there's a concept. The concept is too abstract or too difficult for the student to appreciate. So the mashal is medaber beinyan of inyan acher shalom inyan Atzilus. That's what the pas is. And then he uses this expression later, and he gives an example to understand this. He gives the example of how we in this world try to understand things that are beyond space and time. He said everything we understand in this world is clearly due to the functions of godliness. We can't understand God on His own terms. We understand this to His functions, and all His functions in our mind is bound by time and space. And he says that even though there are people who may have a great mind, he says, Bal Seichel Gadol, or Inyan Naila Belakus, you're talking about either the subject is a very sublime and very abstract one, or the person is a Bal Seichel Gadol, so it means he can abstract and understand things on a very deep level. Even by him, but somewhere concealed, his framework, his context, is connected to some type of space. It's impossible to envision something outside of time and space. That's basically what he's saying here. Bottom line is that we in this world makes it a statement that we cannot truly understand something that's completely outside of space and time. I mean, he begins with space and time, but he focuses primarily on space, which, if you think about it, is absolutely correct. So notice we can abstract, and you could really appreciate a concept. But somewhere, because we are bound by time and space, the concept will be. Which means that still we can talk about something that's higher than space, but we're using it's almost like a mochin. Through our understanding, through that even though we are in a different type, we can talk about something that's outside of space, even though ultimately we related to space. So he says the same thing, that's Asiya de Gashmi is compared to Beriya de Ruchnius. Because that means a physical mind in a physical time and space trying to understand spirituality that's outside of time and space. And same thing he says is how Beriyah understands Atzilus. So talking about Atzilus is a world of divine world. He says there's no yesh at all. In Beriya, zeh masha medaber min yachar shleimin Atzilus. Hana dayidiyah v'asoga lekus de'elma Beriya min yachar she'ena lekus. In Beriya, now you're speaking already now in a language that is not the divine, pure divine, as it is in Atzilus. You're talking about it, but you're explaining it like as you would explain it with a mashal, or as he says, how we speak about outside of space from within a world, a concept that in a world that we can't imagine something outside of space. It's interesting that he uses this example about mochin. The reason I think he uses it because it gives us a very strong appreciation of how distant we are. You remember in the previous class I spoke about this, it's hard even to imagine. Let's say, they could take a look at an apple, physical apple, and then you imagine an apple. So that's Asiyah ruchnis. So you look at a physical object, then you imagine it. You see every detail of it in your mind. But you know clearly in your mind it's only an image of it. You can't eat it. You can't taste it. And if you opened up the brain, you're not going to find it. So it's like a snapshot. It's a mind has an image of it. Fine. Now, there's something there, because it's the image of an apple, it's not an orange. So what is it? However you want to define it. You want to call it brain waves, air waves, the same thing as when the television beams an image from one part of the world to another. What exactly is being beamed? What's going through the wires? You open up a wire, you're not going to find images. So clearly an image can be translated into some type of electrical impulse, or what they call airwave. And that airwave comes back to another box on the other end, and it recreates that image. So, halachically, for example, it wouldn't be called Kel Adam. It wouldn't be called the original voice of a person. And the mitzvahs where you need to have the actual voice heard, whether it's a shefer or whatever. But learning Torah, for example, the Rebbe says you can learn Torah through radio and television, because learning Torah you don't need Kel Adam. You need the understanding of the idea. So who cares how it gets to you? But things that require... My point that I'm trying to make is that they could have the same idea that's expressed through another channel, and it's the same thing, but it's a completely different reality. So in Atzilus, what he's saying, he's giving an example. So when we envision something that's beyond time and space, if you really think about it, at the end of the day, no matter how abstract you are, it's almost it's impossible to really relate to something outside of space. I mentioned, for example, people ask the question, where does the soul go to after Me'ev Esrim Shana, 120 years? Okay. So I often answer to people who ask this question with a mochin example. Imagine electricity asking a refrigerator asking electricity, where do you go when they pull the plug? So the electricity answers to the refrigerator, what do you mean where I go? You're a little box they just invented 100 years ago, and you're like, think now you're the center of the universe. I go back to my regular place where I always was. Just before I was confined in your box. But you don't see anything outside of your box. So you ask, where do I go? As if all existence is inside of a refrigerator. It would be like an ant asking a human being, what's outside of me? The fact is, there's a whole reality that's beyond us. Even when you know that, and it makes total sense. What do we know already in this world? We have a small little vision. Even when we know that, so to speak, where souls go, that's where their natural places, and they're not confined by time and space as we know it, it's still not easy for us to relate to. Because then we start saying, okay, so where are these souls? Fine. They're not in a where. They're everywhere. They're right here in this room. But think about that, how hard it is for us to relate to. So you relate to the concept, but the bottom line is, like he says here, we relate ultimately to time and space. So we understand that Atzilus is not in outer space. But we still think of it, okay, so it's within everything. Well, within. But what does within mean? When we say the word within, you're already speaking conceptual space. So bottom line is, what he's saying is, he's trying to explain that we could still speak about God. And we still speak, for example, we say the world was created, you say Shitaf V'Shinin, right? So 5,772 years ago. Someone asked, what about a second before that? So the famous answer, Zman itself is a nivra, right? Zman is a time, so you can't ask such a question. But what does that mean? You can't ask such a question. Okay, fine. So what exactly, if you can't go, there's no second before. That means it's here now too. Whatever was before Beriya Se'elam is right now here. That means time and L'maylam Zman live side by side all the time. So in Indian, you could say that even Zman was always here, not always here. It's always within the picture of the whole picture. There's a section reserved to time. And it lives within this entity called the L'maylam Zman. So you start thinking about this, it becomes almost impossible to put your hands around it. What does that mean? The only thing you can say is that God is beyond time and beyond time. So there's like the whole, so when you say something is, why is it only 5,000 Tafshin Ayin Beis Shana? It means, because only one part of the big picture. So that part is called 6,000 years. 6 levels, so to speak. It's not 7 levels. It's not 7,000, not 8,000. Yeah. My point is that it's extremely, that he's saying here clearly, the Rebbe Rashab says without hesitation, he says, Eine musse klal echu dover bli mochin. And he's not saying that edel minds can understand that. So, nevertheless, we speak about godliness, and we speak.
You said that the image that you said, in the television image, whatever, it's really mocking. There's no space for it. It's everywhere.
But even everywhere is by us. Everywhere also means a space. It just means it's not limited to one space, limited to all space. So even that means, like, when you say the neshamas, let's say neshamas, so we'll say, yes, they're not bound by, just like in this room there's a table, there are chairs, and there's energy in this room. Energy you can't measure the way you measure a table. A table is 5 feet by 10 feet, whatever. Energy, you'll say, I don't know how to measure it, but there's other measurements. So even when you say energy is not occupying space like the table, you're still thinking in the context of space. You're thinking not this type of space. In other words, it's still the fact that it occupies some type of mochin. It is because we're bound by time and space in that sense. He says even the Rebbe Rashab uses these words. Even a person, a Baal Seichel Gadol, and even a very dakadik thing, a person he says like right before the parentheses. Yesh b'zeh chilukim be'inyan ha'elam va'adakus. He says so even if somebody who is able to understand something, as he says, Be'ezet sir umeir yesh in yatzme shubchin sa'er av behelam al kol hu nitvas b'tzir demokim. So he says basically, in other words, as much as you take away tzir and hakshama, somewhere behelam there's some type of behelam. Somewhere there's some type of context that's still shape. So you say God is not chachma, but you need chachma as your point of reference to say he's not chachma. You can't just speak about it if he's not. So someone says, okay, he's not chachma, he's not binah, he's not das, he's not this. So what is he? You say, well, he's not. No. In other words, you use even shlila. You're using the thing to shale it's not. Like when I said before, neshama is not in the box with the refrigerator. I'm using the box. At the end of the day, it's still the box that is still trying to understand. Okay, so you're not me. That I know. But what you are in your own terms is not so simple to relate to. Besides the fact, by the way, that neshamas we still say are in Gan Eden, they're mochin ruchni, or they're they don't say they're completely outside of space. What means outside of space? We don't even know what that means. We would understand Atzilus, for example, by us is mochin ruchni, not mochin gashmi. It's still mochin. Atzilus is not Beriya.
It's not made up of 10 keiches, right?
Correct. But that's what it's made up of. But we know it's located.
It's consciousness.
Yeah, but we say that it goes from one level to another. What does that mean?
It's not anything. It's just a level.
No, but mochin ruchni we apply to it for sure. We apply every year the yortzeit. We say it goes to the next level. What does that mean?
Higher level of consciousness.
But that's mochin. That's mochin. At the end of the day, that's not physical mochin. It's spiritual mochin. You need something. The bottom line is what he's saying is the mind relates to levels. Call it spiritual levels, but it's levels. That's what he's saying. In other words, to conceive of something that's completely outside of mochin. Look, first of all, he doesn't say neshama is not occupy mochin. I gave that mashal. He says alakus. He says chaz v'shalom yendiv shalakus ein b'bchinas mochin, and it means mochin ruchni too. Anyway, what are you saying? That are you asking a question? What he's saying?
No.
He's saying clearly that we don't understand l'maylam and mochin.
If you pass two neshamas that have the same level of consciousness and awareness, they're both in the same mochin. They're both in the exact same mochin.
So what? But what's also because in ruchni is the mochin. Two things could be in the same place. Fine.
But it's not.
Yeah, but no. One second. What do you define as mochin? Mochin means a position of something. We're not talking about whether it's a physical position or a spiritual position. It's still mochin.
We that live in the 21st century.
I'm saying, one second. I'm asking. He says that we cannot comprehend something l'maylam mochin. Are you saying we could?
I'm saying it's easier for us that we live in the 21st century to bring Mishalim for the.
Did you read this? He says it says bichlal not narasogdil l'maylam mochin. So I'm asking, are you questioning that, or you're?
I'm not questioning this. I'm qualifying it. I'm saying maybe the mochin the way we know it in the gospel.
But he says, what's second? These words. Let's go to the words. Hasagas words. Eina nitruchnis mochin. Hari second. Eina musa klal eichu dover bli mochin. Klal bli mochin. V'lamayla megadersen legamish einan yedim eichu mahu.
But could be the way we have in digital.
But he's being mochin ruchni as well. No. Well, you say I just told you mochin is mochin whether it's gashmi or ruchni. Even when we relate to mochin ruchni, it's still mochin. Mochin gashmi, frankly, is only everyone can relate to something that's not mochin gashmi. Ideas in the brain are not mochin gashmi, but it's still mochin.
But we actually have physical realities to relate to that. We do have things that they didn't have then 100 years ago.
So one second, you're saying to me that the Rebbe Rashab, because if he would be today, he wouldn't write this?
No. It's easier for us to understand.
Well, one second, I need to understand. Hold on. What he's saying here is a klal. It makes no difference how much science we have. We still cannot comprehend something outside of space. All you're saying is that we can that we know there's invisible forces, but invisible forces doesn't mean there's no space. There's no such thing. Even the most abstract scientists, subatomic particles cannot be seen, but they occupy space. That's the bottom line. They occupy some form of space. It's not physical space. Why don't you relate to the fact that can you relate to something that's outside of spiritual space? Conceptual space? Is that also possible?
Shlicha.
What?
Shlicha.
What?
Shlicha.
What's shlicha?
They're shlicha.
But that's also, it's negating something that, by definition, it's saying it's not this. Can you do it without the nishlila, without the negating? That's the point that he's making here, that even when you go with shlila, you can never directly relate to something that's outside of space. Let's talk ruchnistic space. Forget about gashmistic space. Gashmistic space is not even an issue. I'm talking about ruchnistic space. Conceptual space. Why don't you read this and understand? I keep asking you. You're qualifying and saying what he's saying is not correct.
The image that you bought, the image like it's being. That's not gashmistic.
Yes, it is. It's conceptual space. It's not correct. It's within a wire. It's traveling from one place to the other. There's a speed, how fast it travels. We're talking about it's full of.
It's wireless also.
Doesn't matter, but there's a time that it takes to travel from one place to another, and it's still within the context of space. It's just saying that it's not like an airplane, but it's still traveling through space.
Many people can pick it up at the same time.
So what? So it's not physical. It's conceptual space. It's still space. It's defined by all kinds of parameters.
So that space he also had in mind when he said it?
Of course, that's the whole point here. That's the physical space, not to visualize something. You don't need Ayin Beis to conceptualize of something that's not physical space. Anyway, you weren't here yesterday. Why don't you read it inside? It's very, very clear that he's talking here he says, look, I repeat again, he's not without any qualification. The Rebbe Rashab says. I read it a third time. Ein b'sak b'hasa gosenu ein musa klal eichu davar bli mochin. V'ulamayla megeder hasa gosenu legamri she'ein onidim eichu mahu. And therefore, im kein hasa gosenu b'elikus, our comprehension of the divine of elikus, shenitves hakol b'tzir b'chinas mochin ein klal kem husa hasogel yena she'ein b'chinas mochin klal. So our comprehension of the divine that has to some way manifest in some tzir. So even when we say God does not have ears, and God does not have eyes, and God doesn't see, and doesn't hear the way we hear, and as much as you abstract it, we still will ultimately relate to it in some way in context of how we appreciate it. As much as you abstract it. Because you're saying it's not like we hear it, it's not like we see it. But does he see? Does God see what we see? The answer is yes. I don't understand exactly how, but we use that the only point of reference we have. Hashem al Har Sinai. You think that means Gashmias? If God physically came down, where did he come from? Where was he hanging out before? So when we say God came down from Har Sinai, if someone was standing by Har Sinai, what would they have seen? They see Moshe go up on the Har. They see Vayeret Hashem al Har Sinai. They see maybe a cloud comes down. A cloud. Fine, a cloud. But when I say when God comes down, so the only way we can relate to it is, okay, it's not physically climb down the mountain, but just like we would relate to someone coming down a mountain, God in some way is from one spiritual state descended to a lower spiritual state. That's mochin.
But he was here before also.
Okay. So, but nevertheless, that's why we can't comprehend what means higher than space. We have to relate to that in some way it came from one state of, let's say, he was concealed, or one state of consciousness to another state of consciousness. That's called mochin. You remember he said mochin ma'ila mata? What's ma'ila mata in Ruchnis? Is intensity of energy. That's all it is. Or two different fundamental states. The point, however, bottom line is so the only way we can comprehend it is with our tools. With our tools. Now, we can abstract. If you're a very abstract mind, you can...
This is a very important thing in Quran, when it says in Tanakh all over, it says that God went from one place to another place.
Absolutely. Or when it says, Vayera alav Hashem, God revealed himself. Someone saw, Avram Avinu saw God. What did he see? So the Rambam speaks that, like he saw an image or he saw a vision. Did he see something? Or did he experience something so real as if he saw it? Sometimes, for example, you can close your eyes and hear music and feel something that's as if you actually touch it. So you could say it's as real as that. Or did he actually see something? When we say v'niglik k'vei davai v'ro kol bosar yardav, we spoke before about Ayin HaSeichel, if you remember Ayin HaSeichel, right, so there's a level, he said, of Chochmah Zriyah, but then that's Chochmah Enev Bereishay, but then there's Riyah Mamish, that actually the bosar, physical bosar, will see Ayin Bayin, you'll actually see. What does that mean? Since when is sight such a big thing? It's not the sight, it's the reality that sight creates. So if I'm able to relate to something as real as if I saw it, it's for all practical purposes, it's like seeing it. Nevertheless, there's something about actually seeing something physically. Look, these are hard concepts. The bottom line, however, is the Rebbe Rashab wanted to explain how you have a state how a lower, basically it's all coming to explain the Parsha. How in the world of Beriya, like he says, then he continues. That just like our comprehension is completely different type of comprehension than it is in the spiritual worlds of Biyah, because like he said before, Malachim are able to experience something that's beyond space. We cannot. Completely. The same thing, the same thing is Biyah compared to Atzilus. So all this thing with space was meant to give an example of how distant Beriya is from Atzilus. And that's what he says. And that's what it means it's me'inyan acher.
This is interesting with Masaga Atzilus. Who has that Asaga? Not us.
So he says, and that's Atzilus itself. The Atzilus harei kol alakus, ve'en shayach shem inyan yeshus klal. When you speak in a different idiom, in a different context, so you're using an example, something that's not purely divine, something that is yesh, to understand that which is elikus. Okay, then he began, and we're going to continue here from page Ayin Beis where I left off. He began another discussion now. Now, seemingly there's a question on the table. It says in the Zohar, the ime law, which is binah, kana comes from the word like nest. Nests in Kursaya is the seat, the throne, which is the world of Beriya. So as I explained, the four levels of spheres, Chochmah, Binah, Midas, Zoh, and Malchus. So Zohar says Chochmah Mekanna be'Atzilus. Binah is nested in Chochmah. In other words, the primary Atzilus is primarily driven by Chochmah. Binah nests in Beriya. Zoh Midas is in Yetzirah, and Malchus is in Asiya. So clearly, from here we see that Atzilus, the binah of Atzilus, is in Beriya. Nevertheless, he says, you cannot compare the way Bina is in the world of Beriya as it is in Atzilus. He explains the Atzilus because Bina in Atzilus is united with Chochmah. So though we discussed earlier chapters that Bina is of a completely different personality than Chochmah, but in Atzilus they are united. The river flowed out of Eden. The river is Bina, the Cheves Hanar, because the river is already the flow of ideas. Chochmah is the Mayan. The Chochmah Bina Mayan v'Nar. As it's known, the Chochmah Bina are like the spring of water, the root, in other words, the source. V'Nar is the river that flows out of it. The Mayan hu Neviya Daka. In a Mayan, when you go to a Mayan, you don't see a whole ocean or a river or a spring is just a small trickle. So Neviya Daka means a very subtle flow. So Ayin de Chochmah. So the example of that is Ayin de Chochmah. Chochmah, you don't see a lot of expansive ideas. It's a spark. It's one that could Ayin. It's almost nothing. Basically substanceless. But it's the source of everything. Ubina hu b'chinas haspashtus. And Bina is already an expression, expansiveness. The expanse, right? The expanse of the river, expansiveness. Uksiv nor Yetzira. What does the mean Yetzira mean? That the river goes out of, leaves. Shu Yetzira tamid b'li hefsek. No, Yetzira means that the river is constantly flowing, is constantly emerging, it's constantly flowing out from b'li hefsek without any impediment or block or stop. Meaning that the Nor Yetzirah, that the river is flowing constantly without any block. So what time? Huh? Okay. In the form of it's united and dvekus and attached. And afterwards the pasuk continues, and from there it separates. As the pasuk goes, the river flows out, and from there it separates into 4 different rivers. That's the pasuk. So what's the pshat yiparid? Pirush achashirim shum b'chinas binah l'b'chinas malchus. So Eden is chachma. No Yetzirah Eden. The binah leaves the spring, the source. It flows continuously, but after it flows through all of Atzilus, all the way till Malchus, Misham Yiparid, and then it separates into 4 rivers. That's the 4 worlds. It's discussed elsewhere why it's 4, it's 3 worlds, because it's not Atzilus already. But bottom line is it separates. So after Malchus, it spreads out and it manifests in the 3 worlds of Beriya, Yetzirah, Asiyah. So now it's no longer the way it was flowing from binah, if it was flowing from chacham, was an attached and connected flow. Now it's already separated, and now it's called yiparid. Misham yiparid. Parid means separate, but yiparid also means, spiritually speaking, it's no longer a direct flow. It's a pirid.
It's in parallel instead of in a series.
I wouldn't say that. I would say it's separate from the source now.
Yeah, but they each go into, one doesn't go through the other.
Separate tracks, he's trying to say.
One doesn't go through. In other words,
that's technically. That's, of course, it's 4 rivers that came from one original. It was like this. It was a spring, 1 river, then split into 4 rivers, and these 4 rivers go differently. There's the Euphrates, there's the Narpros, there's the Nardekel, Chidekel. There's different rivers. But in spiritually speaking, he's saying it's a pirud. It's no longer attached. The river is attached to its original source. Now the rivers are become separate, spiritually speaking, from the source.
They still have to be connected, also when they dry up. Right?
Physically, yes, but spiritually not. That's the word yiparid. And physically, the fact that now became misham yiparid, from there it's split into different rivers. When you speak spiritually speaking, Beriya is not just another river like Atzilus. Like binah is a flowing river that's directly connected without a hefsek. This one now has a hefsek, so it's not physical. Listen, we're talking spiritually now. So spiritually, Beriya is going through a pasha, as he said. There's a screen that separates the two. Technically speaking, the flow, You're trying to physically connect it to physical rivers? It's not physical rivers.
Yeah, Atzilus doesn't go into Beriya, and Beriya doesn't go into Yetzirah.
That's not what he's saying. No, that's not what he said. Pure. Yes, we're not talking. We're talking about the way Atzilus goes into Beriya is not the way Chachma goes into binah. That's the point. Chachma and binah is a direct flow. Binah, as he said, is yichud. It's united with Chachma. He's asked the question. Binah of Atzilus is nested in Beriya. So he's explaining it's not the same as binah in Atzilus. It's different as when binah is now in Beriya. The difference is there it's attached like the river that's attached to the spring in Gan Eden. Now we're outside of Gan Eden right now. It's a whole different state of being. So physically, yes, it's rivers. Of course you could trace them back. Of course you could trace Beriya back to the source. But spiritually speaking, it's a whole different level now. Now it's outside of the...
Well, everything that says in the Chumash...
There's no period in Atzilus. In Atzilus you can't say things are separate. There's no such thing as separate levels. Everything is united. There's different levels, but they're not separate. Separate as in Kedusha, that where there's a divisiveness, so to speak. Right, so here, that's what he's saying. So, Misham Yiparid. Jacobson is able to dash shishim hey malachas durush harishin.
I just want to ask him something. Everything that says in the Chumash, it has to be in a physical sense, or could be just a interpretation of what's going on between the Chacham and Atzilus and Beriya.
What do you mean? I'm not sure what you're saying.
The law Yetzirah made and all that has to actually be that it's physically happened like that, or it's a representation of higher.
Both. Ein mikri yetzim b'dei pshutei. Everything has its pshat, its literal meaning, but its deeper meaning.
Right, everything has to manifest itself physically.
If it says in the Chumash, we believe that everything that says in Chumash also means literal. That there were actually 4 rivers, and there was actual Gan Eden. I mean, this is discussed in many places. The Rebbe brings about it in the Chelik Chav Gimel. Look at the Sicha. There's a whole Sicha, Shavuos, about the Nitzchis of Torah. So he explains that even though that the true deeper meaning in every pshat is there's deeper meanings in Drush, Remez, Drush, and Sod, all the way to the spiritual, and that's where it originates, but it still did come down. There wasn't Avram Avinu, physical Avram Avinu. In other words, there's two distorted ways you can interpret it. You could say there's a physical Avram, there's nothing spiritual. You could say there's only a spiritual Avram, and he never lived physically. The Jews actually left Mitzrayim, even though the real leaving of Mitzrayim was leaving Mitzrayim Gvulim, is the spiritual redemption that took place. But they actually left a place called Mitzrayim. In other words, the spiritual manifests in the physical. I discussed yesterday at length, the spheres, Chesed and Gvura actually come into fire and water. There's actual fire and water. We live in a real world here. This material world is not an illusion. Even though it is a keli, a container that's hiding, and within it is manifest spiritual energies. So what really makes fire fire? It's Gvura. But the fire has now become fire. Gvura, in the spiritual sense, is not going to burn you like a physical fire will. Yeah. No, because there are theories, you could say, mystical teachings that say this world is just an illusion, and all it is really spiritual energy, and that's all it is. We say it's both. It's spiritual, is the driving force behind it. Like the soul within the body, but there is a body.
Non-Jewish.
Huh?
Non-Jewish.
Look, Bedakus, the Rambam Shita, that the ultimate reward will be, Elam Haba will be souls without bodies, is because of the thinking of that type of philosophy, that the body and the ultimate material is an inferior and a superficial and a temporary state. Basically, Rambam holds that the future will be, there will be no longer physical, corporeal. And Chassidus does not hold it, because God created the Gashmis is just as important as the Ruchnis, if not more. However, someone to say Gashmis is the Ikir, it's not the Ikir, it's the Tofel. It goes both ways. It's understanding that the Kavan, the purpose is the body and the refining Tachtem, the material world. But understand the driving engine is the spiritual. So it's a constant back and forth. So now we continue. So we established that binah, as it nests in Atzilus and the Beriya, even though it originates from Atzilus, it's in a completely different state.
Well, the reason why I asked is because of there's a lot of mefashim that say that the whole thing is a mochin.
That's that particular sefer, but they don't say the rest of the Torah is a mochin. Right? No one's going to say that. No, but don't you ever hear someone has a theory that Avram Yitzchak Yankov never existed, and they were only a mochin? There's a Torah, legitimate Torah theory like that? I don't think so. We know that, but that someone should say they didn't live? They actually were not born, and they didn't exist on this earth? I've never seen a Torah source say that. There are things where, there's also the question like the Ramem Epana that brings in the Chuvas about what it says, B'tzudas Gdelis, whether it's a guzma or it's real. So he says, Beruchnis, it's real. The Begashmis, it may have been a guzma. Or things like that. I tell you, that Sikha in Chelek Chov Gimel talks about whether some things you could say, but for sure not everything. You can to say for sure not. That's not even a question. Then basically you could say Yetzirah Mitzrayim never happened. It was only the spiritual part of it that happened. Even though the spiritual is more important than the physical, to be very honest. That's why when we say Chayav Adam Liris Zatz Mekili Yetzirah Mitzrayim, we're not talking about physically. You mean it's there for sure means spiritual. Anyway, now he continues. V'agam de be'elam ha'Beriyah yesh hasogel l'kuyus. And even though Beriya, there's a comprehension of godliness. Nevertheless, it's not at all similar to the comprehension the way it's in Atzilus. This is a very fundamental chapter, because what he's doing here is debunking the myths that we may convince ourselves that we got it figured out. As I said, we've been talking about Esesfiris, Hagnuzas, Lifnei Tzimtzum, Ak, Kav. Basically, the Rebbe Rashab is bringing us down to earth here. He's saying, with all the depth and everything, the bottom line is we live in a world that's bound by time and space. And it's not that simple to envision that which is beyond. Even when you envision what's beyond, it's also pretty much bound by our rules, by our tools. Nobody, for example, when Einstein conceived of the theory of special relativity in 1905, so it says he was not sitting with formulas and trying to figure out science. He was dreaming. He was daydreaming. He was imagining things. One of his thought experiments was he imagined himself riding on a photon of light. Light, the particles of light, or the way measurements of light, rather, is photons. He imagined himself riding on light. Think about that, like a kid. Imagine yourself like on a light beam, sitting on a light beam, and I think of it like a flying carpet, and you're flying through space. So right there you see, first of all, even when you imagine, your imagination is also within the context of riding on it, light. We're not light. We could think about light. We can understand it. But because he was able to do that, he suddenly came up with ideas that others didn't come up. But even the deepest and most abstract mind is still using context. You're using examples, because the question is, can we really free ourselves completely with our minds? I'm not talking now with our hearts and even with our imaginations, completely of context. I would say it's almost, the Rabbi Rashab says it's impossible. Because even your imagination, like it says, the Gemara says, you can't dream of pila b'kupa demachta, which means that an elephant going through the eye of a needle. So, 1 second, it says you can't. You dream everything except that. 1 second. The Rebbe brings, that you could even dream that. So they ask the Rebbe, what do you mean? It says in the Gemara and Brachos you can't. So the Rebbe says, it also says you dream by night, but you think about it by day. If you thought about it by day, you could dream that too. But that's also, even pila b'kupa demachta, why? Because you can't imagine, how is an elephant going to fit through an eye of a needle? So when you think about it, tell me, how would you dream? The only way it's possible is because the elephant, for some seconds, squeezes through. It should stay an elephant and go through the eye of a needle is almost impossible. But now there's a thing called nimna ham nimnois. In Sfarim it talks about, nimna is the example they give is, can someone be reichiv ve'ena reichiv bebas achas? Meaning you're riding on a horse and not riding at the same time. We can't envision such a thing. Yeah, of course we can imagine. You start saying, okay, the theory would be maybe there's two people. One of them is on the horse, one is not on the horse. Or quantum, two possibilities. But even that, you're talking all in the realm. First of all, it's hard to even go there because you need to have all kinds of theories. Why do you need theories? Because we don't think in terms, when something is this, it's not that. Can something be black and white at the same time? And I'm not talking about a mix, that it has some black and some white. I'm talking about, is it black or it's white? Can it be day and night at the same time? Okay, we have bein hashmoshes. But again, bein hashmoshes is a combination of the two. It's a boundary, whatever it is. The point I'm trying to make is that the Rebbe Rashab is not trying to... So he's saying that Beriya, basically Beriya's comprehension of the divine is very different than the way it's in Atzilus. It's using an example. V'yesh leimer, now he continues to explain it. V'yesh leimer, we can say, the klolos b'chinas ha-meichen de Beriya, the general intelligence of Beriya, hem b'chinas meichen ha-shayochem el hamidus, is the level of intelligence that is connected with shayochim, bound with that shayochim, related to midas, emotions. This is something you already talked about before. Remember, because it's known there are two levels in intelligence, in intellect, mochin be'etzem and mochin hashayachim el midas. Mochin be'etzem, the mind as it is on its own, essential mind, intellect, and a mind as it relates to emotions, to feelings. The mochin be'etzem was essential mochin is the comprehension of an essential idea, the thing itself, the essence of the thing, shemasik b'sichli, that he comprehends with his mind. Or mochin shalamidus hu shemasik tev hadavar, and the mind within of emotions is that he comprehends the goodness of the thing. Remember, we learned that earlier. Actually, there he said that was midas shebemechin. That because of that, you have to love this thing. Even though this too is intellect and comprehension, it's not you're thinking about the analysis and the dissecting of the subject matter itself, but you're already thinking how it relates to basically it's only related to the reaction and the feeling you have to it. So it's a very big difference when you're discussing a subject matter. Let's say we're analyzing the Higgs boson, okay? This new particle that they seemingly discovered. or you're analyzing a light wave, or the sun rays, or for that matter, a computer, whatever. So you're sitting, a mind, two people sitting, or one person is reading on it and analyzing and studying it. There's no midas involved. At this point, you're trying to simply understand the subject matter. When you start thinking, mochin shach midas means you're thinking, is this good for me? Or now that I realize what it is, now comes another stage of thinking, this thing, after I've finished studying about it and understanding it, it's really good. It's a very worthwhile product. Since it's a worthwhile product, I'm going to invest in it, or I'm going to buy it, or I want to get it, I want to acquire it. So that's a different mochin. The mochin is it's still mind. Your mind is still functioning here. We're not talking now a full-blown emotion per se. The mind is now telling you the conclusion of my studies is that this thing is worthwhile acquiring, or it's not worthwhile. Is it good? Is it something that's good? Is it good? The value of it. Or b'cholos yeser, and even more generally speaking, the mind that's connected to the emotions is the outer dimension of intellect. As the intellect comes into the garments of comprehension. In other words, he's saying he's lifting it a little higher. It's not just you're thinking about the feelings, whether you like it or not, whether it's something likable or not. It's still mochin, but it's chitzenis. Even though it's a comprehension of the essential item itself, meaning in the concept, in the intellectual, in the seichel, in the idea behind it. Not in that it's in the goodness of it, in its value, or its qualities. Nevertheless, it's already closer to the emotions and the feelings. So bottom line is we're still dealing with intellect, but you're dealing now with something that's already beginning to think in terms of context of value. In other words, it's not just an abstract idea. You're already applying that idea to some type of value to us as people. So Pnimis HaMechin would be where you're concentrating purely on the idea and there's no subjective interest at all. As soon as you begin to think in terms of that it has some type of subjective value, it's already kiruvel amidus. It's already close to the emotions. Recall, we discussed this earlier when he spoke about mochin and midas a few chapters back. Remember, he spoke about, I think it was which chapter? Was it 37? No. Yeah, 37, as well as and 39. 39 was the main chapter. We spoke that mochin is higher than ishtalshlus. The two types of ilah va'ala. Remember the two types of ilah va'ala? So if you remember, he spoke about midah shebemochin was where the mind sees the goodness in it. And midas itself is where the mind says, where the midas say, it's good for me. So there's like three stages. First you conceive of an idea, you concentrate on it. Then you come to a point and say, this thing is good. And then you come and say, it's good for me. So here he's still talking about the first two. He's not talking about good for me. He's saying in the mind itself, there's a stage. Here he doesn't call it actually midas. He calls it mochin shayach and midas. He's not calling it midas shebemochin. That's interesting. It's a little different. But the bottom line is that there's two stages. One is purely thinking of an objective idea, and the other one is already beginning to relate it to something that has value. Now he's going to speak about it in Aveda, like in a divine contemplation, a divine hisbonenus, a divine meditation or contemplation, bislapshus levusha asogya. That when it's manifest in the garments of comprehension, meaning the details, working it through. He grasps only the outer dimension of the divine that has a relationship that's related to the worlds and the creations. Pashtus, what he's saying is that when you begin to think about God, you don't think about God in an abstract form where there's no connection to you. You think of God in terms of He created the world, like we say in Psukkah de Zimra, the beauty of the world. You think about His greatness, how He gives you life, the blessings He offers. Like He said before, that we contemplate God on the pu'ulas, the functions of God in our lives. When you bench, that God sustains every creature, sustains us. So all this is contemplation of godliness, but it's godliness as it's manifest and connected to the worlds. I'm talking about the lower, he's talking about obviously a basic contemplation. We're not talking about going deeper into Seviv Kalam and Atzmus and so on. It's very similar to the ideas he spoke earlier about mochin and midas. And therefore, nirgish bezeh, it's sensed and felt in this, the goodness of godliness, meaning hergish atzmi, as he said before, hergish atzmi, that you're feeling yourself, not atzmi as an atzmius. He said hergish atzmi, he said midas is defined hergish atzmi, that you sense yourself, how God, that God's closeness to me, or my closeness to God, kirvas alikim, being close to God is li tev, is good for me. Because what this mind is grasping when it's doing this contemplation is the levels of the divine, the godly levels that are close, that are in a state of closeness to the creatures, to the world, to existence. And he grasps it in the garments of contemplation. The person has not gone out of his crass materialistic thinking. It's interesting. In other words, we're not talking about thinking about a taiva, but he's still in his own state. He's thinking about, let's say, you think about your life, and God gives you a heart and a mind, and He's giving you the power to breathe. Now He's giving you food and sustenance. You've not gone out of your materialistic life. The only thing is you're appreciating the blessings that God gave you. It's not forcing you to go out of your comfort zone. Look, it's out of your comfort zone by acknowledging that there's a God. But meaning to say, it's not going out of your akshamashe. Adarabah, ha'inyan bo b'akshamashe b'akshamas sichle. This inyan, how God is good for you, meaning how God manifests in nature and in creation, is on the contrary. This inyan is coming specifically like a commensurate with in your Akshamas Sichle. One second, before the prince. Akshamas Sichle. In other words, you are bringing down God into your Aksham, into your understanding of it. So when someone say, is that really God? Or is that what's good for you about God? God that He sustains you, that He gives you health, that He gave you healthy children, that He sends you blessings, or that God is the designer of the universe and you see the world working in a very beautiful way. So you're basically God, that your appreciation there of godliness is according to your Hakshamas Sichli, not outside of it. Well, we'll see where he's going with this. Ve'ena kamei, in the parentheses he adds, Ve'ena kamei Hakshamas Hamidus. This is still a seichel. It's not like the Hakshamas Hamidus, the crassness or the coarseness of the feeling, of emotions. 1 second. Well, let me read from these parentheses. Apashta is what he means. I'll explain in a moment. In general, every intellectual contemplation, comprehension, is in general some type of elevation and connection to something that's beyond the person, beyond him. Why? Because you're trying to comprehend something that's not you. You're trying to understand something. He's distinguishing that even though he said it's akshama, it's still beyond you, but like it says elsewhere. However, when it's manifest in the garments of comprehension, he does not go out of his personality or identity and his essential personality, and he remains in his own original position. Okay, let's analyze this. It's basically Hakshamis Hamidis is lower level. When a person is already now thinking purely what's in it for me, that's real midas. That means what complete subjectivity means. What's in it for me? Is it good for me? Is it not good for me? Here he's talking about still on the contemplation level. You're thinking about God, so you've clearly gone to a place that's beyond yourself. It's not just what's in it for me. That would be Akshamis Hamidis. But you're not thinking about God completely on God's terms. You're thinking of God on your terms as well. Basically, it's like three levels, you can say. You can completely think about God on God's terms, which has nothing to do with any benefits or like you said, tevli, etc. Then you talk about in Levushi Hasaga, it's already coming into your appreciation, so it's coming into your terms. You're speaking about God on your terms. And then there's Akshamis Hamidis would be completely you. Even if it's you, that's, by the way, not bad you. That doesn't mean Taivas. He's not saying Taivas. But the focus is on you. Here the focus is on God, but how God is still in your mind with the matzav. In other words, you're fitting God into the benefits to your life, essentially. Which will lead to the Midas. Anyway, bottom line, Valkain had a bekiruv ele hergish, the kirvus alikim li tev. And therefore, because that's how you're comprehending it, in your way, your seichel, your akshamis ha-seichel, your so-called terms, your without changing who you really are, your personality. That's why it's close to a feeling. It's not yet med midas, remember, but it's close to a feeling. The kivus alikim liteiv, that the closeness of godliness is good for me. Shezeh ha-bechein sho'in mochin shebemidas. That is the bechein. That's the result of this contemplation, which is mochin shebemidas. So there's midas shebemochin and there's mochin shebemidas. So the midas and the mochin is you're thinking that it is good, not just about the thing itself, but that it's good. And mochin shebemidas, he said earlier as well, is when it's good for me. He spoke about these stages, but the bottom line is that's the bechein, that's the result. But till now he's been speaking about mochin hashayachim the midas. He didn't call it midas shebemochin. I just want to point that out. So mochin be'etzem. There's mochin as they are on their own. There's mochin hashayachim the midas is what he's been discussing when you're thinking about it, and it's already relevant. Bottom line, it's coming to understanding its value and God is on our terms. And then there's the bechein. The result of that is that for me it's good, and that's mochin shebemidas. And then there's the midas itself, the feeling itself of good. Wow. Now he's going to mochin be'etzem. By contrast, when the comprehension is abstracted from the garments of comprehension. Now you're thinking about the etzem inyan, godliness itself, not in any relation, any subjective personal interest. Then he's closer, much more closer, increasingly closer to the essence of the divine. The way Elikus, godliness, is higher than manifestation in the worlds and in the creations. So then you're thinking about God on God's terms, basically. Not how God is manifest in the world. It's basically like Mamalaklama. When you say, just like a soul fills the body and gives it life, God fills the world and gives it life. That you're thinking about God as God is in nature. The beauty of nature, the gift of life, the blessing of children, health, parnasa, livelihood. I mean, there's a whole list. How God is running the show of this world. Ashgacha pratis. At the end of the day, something special happened that day. You thank God. This is all godliness, but it's godliness as is manifest in as he says, Elimus and Ivraim. Then there's godliness that is God on God's terms. This is a different level. Then you talk about the etzem in Yalaki.
Is that Elokim?
B'chlal, one is Elokim and one is Havaya. Elokim is Gematria Teva. But here he didn't say that difference. V'gam, okay. Basically, all this is coming to explain the difference between Beriya and Atzilus. That's the bottom line. Beriya is the lower level. He said, Yeshlemer, this is all coming to explain that Beriya, the Hasogim, Beriya is mochin shayachim alamidus. So Beriya is already how God manifests in terms of the world. That's why it's called Beriya. I mean, it's a beautiful explanation because it really comes down to explain why the image is only that way. Well, let me just think what he said before. Like the mushal. It's a mushal. Okay. V'gam, and also an additional element in all this is shebezehu yetzim mehusak shamase. Besides the fact, in this step, mochin be'etzem, when he contemplates on the idea itself, so he's thinking about God, not in terms of God's relationship with the world, with existence. There's another thing that happens here. This also causes him to go out of his hakshama, his crassness, his framework. Because this contemplation on the divine as it is on its own, it's in a form of abstraction. And it's in a form of elevation and clinging to, cleaving to, connecting to the essential divine idea, the divine entity. And that's why it doesn't yet have a relationship and a connection with the emotions. This is the level of mochin itself, intellect itself, that's higher than emotions. Okay. So Beriya would be basically, as he says Yeshlemer, that the klal is mochin of Beriya, the way binah of Atzilus goes into Beriya, that's the masham yiparid, the separation, that's how mind is connected already to something, some value, some connection to our existence. And mochin be'etzem would be how we think about godliness on godliness terms, not its connection to existence. Okay. Now he goes farther, higher. And on a higher level, he's explaining this whole thing now on a higher level. Mochin, the mind that has a relation, that has a relation, connection. What did I say? A relation with? With emotions, is the contemplation of the divine that manifests within the worlds. Because in general, this is the b'derech klal. Because in general, this is only a reflection. And the contemplation of this is an understanding the method, the way, the degree, the way each the energy and the revelation exists in each world. Till now he was explaining mochin shayachim l'midas means that you understand. It's still contemplation of that concept, but it's already getting closer to its value, to its value. Since you talk about its value, you're already talking some type of subjective interest. Now he's speaking a little higher. One second, let me qualify that. And that part of the divine, that part of mochin shayachim l'midas, means that you're talking about how godliness is connected to the worlds and to existence. Yeah. Now he's saying a little more subtly. He's saying mochin shayachim l'midas is not so much about the value of the thing, but you're talking about how godliness is in manifest in the worlds. And that's just a reflection. The contemplation is, in other words, how God relates to each world according to the measure of that particular world. He's moving it away a little from the subjective connection to the emotions and is moving it back to the levels of godliness as they manifest in each world. It's a very subtle difference, because before he was also talking about, he said several times, that since you're talking about how it's connected to benefit, to some value, that's why you have to say that you're thinking about God as it manifests in the worlds. Now he's only focusing on God's manifestation in the worlds. He's calling this L'mayli Yetzirah. Mochin be'etzem hu asoga b'medrega nailas be'erin sof baruch hu shalamayim b'chinas slapshus be'elis. And mochin be'etzem, fundamental, essential mind, intellect, is the contemplation of higher levels of the divine infinite light that's higher than manifestation in the worlds. In other words, before mochin hashayachim l'midas and mochin be'etzem was really more in connection, is it about me, or some connection to us, or is it about godliness itself? Now he's saying, is it godliness as it's connected to the worlds, or is it about godliness that's beyond the worlds? It's somewhat of it's a little subtler and a little higher context. Because if you look before, he also said L'maylam b'chinas slapshus, but there was more subjective language in the first understanding of these two states. Here is less subjectivity. Here it's just talking about two different levels of godliness. Yeah. In other words, a little before was more avodadik, so to speak. Midas as in what connection to me. Now he's calling midas more is godliness as it manifests in the worlds. So it's like God connecting to something outside of himself, to the worlds, and his feeling to the world. Like he has love for the world. So that's what mochin shaykh l'midas is.
On the word Beriya at this point,
yeah, more on the existence, exactly, on the nature of on the levels of godliness. Before it was actually more using the word midas was more the feeling that we have. Before it was more like his abundance during davening that you would have. This one's more like, this itself is a little more intellectual than the previous understanding of it. Why he's going that deep into it, I'm not sure, but it's interesting how. Okay. Now he's going back to concluding this. The general comprehension of the world of Beriya, of the world of Beriya, he's repeating what he said at the beginning, but he's summing it up now. Remember in the beginning he said, so general comprehension, we can say, is the mind as it's connected to midas, meaning both interpretations that he just said. The levad the Atzilus canal, that besides the fact, or addition to the fact, that in their fundamental levels there's a distinction between intellect and Beriya, is distinguished from the intellect and Atzilus, as we discussed earlier. We said there before, Chachma and binah are connected and united, and here it's not. So in addition to that, the general, so even, forget about midas, even mochin be'etzem in Beriya is fundamentally different than, it just sees things differently, it comprehends things differently than Atzilus. So he says now, in addition to that, the general mind, or the intellect of Beriya, is one that is related to midas. And I would say both meanings. One, related to midas, meaning you're already beginning to think the value of godliness to existence. Or the second, a little higher interpretation, you're talking about God as it manifests in existence, and not Atzilus, you talk more about God that's a little higher than existence. Ubepratis, and more in detail, more specifically, yesh b'zeh chiluki madregas. And when you break it down, it has even more, there are many different levels here. Because also in Atzilus you have both levels. You also have mochin be'etzem, the way mochin mind is in its own, and the mind is connected to emotions. You see how complicated this gets? Yeah. That specifically. Only in general, the general concept of intelligence, In Beriya, they are the intellect that's connected more to midas, meaning more to existence, more to subjectivity, more to a relationship with us. Hanikra mochin diyanika. He's introducing a new term now. These are called mochin diyanika. And we know there's the three levels of mochin that we're going to talk much later. There's ibur, yanika, mochin. So ibur is literally gestate pregnancy. Yanika is the stage of when there's the nursing stage, and mochin is mature intelligence. There's three stages of maturity. This is the middle one. So he says Beriya is midas. That's mochin diyanika, because you see, for example, a child's intelligence primarily is subjective intelligence. It cannot yet abstract. It thinks in terms of what's good for me, what's not good for me. So it's called mochin diyanika. The emotions nurse from this level. This is still so-called immature, or you can say small mochin, childish mochin, relatively speaking. Because obviously Beriya is a pretty high level, but relative to Atzilus. And this is what it says, that the world of Beriya, you have tchila v'rechimu, which is love and awe. Tchila v'rechimu is ava and yira in Aramaic. Sichlim. It's sichlim. It's the intelligent ava and yira, the intelligent midas. Meaning the midas shabamechin propashtus. Like it says in Tanya chapter 39. Ve'hein hamidas habayim ha'bina v'adas. Okay, actually it's midas, it's meichel sheba midas. Well, he says this. This is the midas, the emotions that come from bina and das. That's Beriya. Atzilus b'chinas meichen the gadlos, and Atzilus you have mature, the great mind, meichen the gadlos, which means mature intelligence. Ve'elam haYetzira, now he goes to Yetzira. Ha'ikaru b'chinas hamidas. In Yetzira primarily is midas, like I said before. Remember, binah is mekanano nests in Beriya. Midas nests in Yetzira. V'hainu b'chinas ruach. That's the level of ruach. So Asiyah is nefesh, Yetzira is ruach, Beriya is neshama, and Atzilus is chaya or yechida. So now Yetzirah is primarily midas. We said Beriya is mochin sheba midas, or mochin hashayachim, the mind that is connected to emotions, as you just discussed at length. In Atzilus, it's primarily mind, even though it breaks it down. There's also both levels there. Beriya is mind that's already connected to midas, that's already binah. That's why he said binah, tchila v'chimas sichlim, binah. And in Yetzirah now is primarily emotions. There's also mochin there. Remember, everything has everything in it. But there, the mochin, the intelligence, is only what is relevant to governing the feelings. So it's even lower than in Beriya. It's the mind that will ultimately say something is good and value. It's connected, it's related to midas. Here it's hanhogus midas. Here it's the mind as it's telling the midas how to behave. So it's a lower level. Very, very subtle levels here of intellect. I mean, if you break it down, how the mind and emotions communicate, you basically have here, I count here at least 5-6 levels, if not more. There's in Atzilus, the 2. In Beriya, there's the 2 and maybe 3 because he interpreted a second interpretation. And there's Yetzirah,
Just which one is dominant? Both.
Yeah, no. It's also the process how a pure concept that has no connection to you slowly define the value of it, then the value for you. Then now already I am benefiting from it, but you need now intelligence how to go get it. Let's say you determine now that this idea is valuable. Okay. Then comes another stage and you say it's valuable for me. Now comes the next stage. Now I want to get it. So now you need to have a whole new wisdom of how am I going to acquire this thing. So this is now already mochin that's l'anhogus. I mean, it's no longer you're not contemplating on the value of the object. You're contemplating how am I going to maneuver to acquire this thing. That's seichel that's shaykh to anhogus hamidus. That's already similar to how animals have seichel hanikna. Their intelligence is only in order how to hunt and how to get what they need. It's not.
That's connected to Nehi already.
Here it's called. I said seichel shaykh lan hagus hamidus. So commercial yesh hefresh.
It's like Nehi.
Well, yeah. Well, he didn't say Nehi yet, but he's calling it. One second, midas. Commercial yesh hefresh ben cotton legadol. The midas tivim. Right. Like we see the difference between a child and an adult. The midas tivim. In their natural emotions, in their natural feelings. Even an adult also follows his nature. Also is drawn, nimshach, he gravitates after his nature, after nature. But it's not at all how a child follows his nature. In other words, they both have something that is, let's say, drawing them. Because the adult, because of his mature intelligence, it affects the emotions that he should follow his seichel. So, for example, when a child, someone you take something away from a child, the child will have a tantrum, and the mind is not yet, it doesn't yet have self-control. That the mind, an adult, you take something away, he may also have a tantrum inside, but his intelligence tells him it's embarrassing or tempers the emotions. Don't get so excited. So it's not that he's not affected by things in this world. His nature affects him, but his mind tempers and monitors and governs the feelings. Now, what about people who are exactly like a child? They're only concealing it. That's another story. He was talking about someone who's already more mature. So this is levels of maturity. Basically, you have a model here of the Elamus, the worlds of maturity. Atzilus is the most mature. Beriya is already getting down to the next stage where it's mochin that's related to midas, to feelings. And here we're talking about someone at least, in Yetzirah, at least you have somebody who's not behaving like a baby. He still has emotions. His emotions is his driving force, but the emotions are somewhat governed and tempered and defined by the mind. V'hein mochin hashayachim la'anhagas hamidas levad. That's even that. That's the mochin, the intellect that's connected, that's related to governing, to controlling, you can say, to anhagas. It's like the captain, guiding the emotions alone. That's not what's a Beriya. Beriya, he says, is mochin shayachim lamidas. It's primarily intellect, but it's intellect that's connected to some feeling at the end. Here, it's the opposite. Primarily, it's feelings, but it's the mind that's connected to governing those feelings. Asiya, and the lowest level is the world of Asiya, b'chinas nefesh. So we covered neshama, ruach, nefesh. He said ruach and nefesh. He didn't say neshama by Beriya, but it's obvious. Asiya is nefesh. That's the lowest. Hu inyan hamaisim b'peil mamish. This is Asiya, as the word implies. This is already actions, concrete actions, b'peil mamish, in actuality, in actualization. So now you're already talking no longer just feelings, now you're actually acting on it. There's also intelligence in that. But they're completely diminished, completely in a very, katnus here really means diminished, small, very, there's a word for it, very infantilized, like in a way. Not katnus as immature, it's more simply, the mochin is very, very concealed. Legamri. They're completely in a state of katnus, smallness. The hainu in diminished state, smallness, infant-like state, small state, minuscule. The hainu rak ma sheshayach la'asiyah levad. Here the intelligence is only what is relevant and related to the action itself. Okay, so the intelligence in knowing how to get what you want emotionally is involved in, like, it's an intelligence that's telling you how to govern those emotions. Let's say you discover something you love. So now love is the emotion, and the mind is telling the emotion here are the ways to go get what you want, what you love. Mice is already the actual action. The actual action itself. Let's say you love to write. Now you're sitting down to write. So there's an intelligence that's involved in the actual writing. So you're not dealing anymore now with the emotional dimension, you're dealing with the actualization part. The kol zehu comprehension is part of the Ayin Beis, and all this is like we discussed earlier in chapter 2. Remember, he's winding down now to the thing that discussed in chapter 2. B'mosel b'nefesh ha'adam, in the example of the spirit of man, sh'aseichel nimshach mislabish b'kol ha'keiches, that the intelligence, nimshach, extends, is drawn, and mislabish, and manifests in all the faculties. So if you remember back then, he discussed, mochin primarily rests in the brain, in the mind. But it definitely affects, he spoke about the koyach to write with your hands, the koyach to walk, the power to walk. Mind also impacts every part of the being, of all faculties. The essence of the intellect is in the mind, in the brain, in the head. What manifests in emotions and feelings is only the outer dimension. He's connecting it to what he spoke in chapter 2. It's only the outer dimension of intelligence. And especially, specifically in the faculty and the power to move and to walk. Hatanu means to move, meaning also to move with your arms. They also have a seichel manifest in them. But there, it's only maisa. So you have the way the intellect manifests in emotions. You have the way the intellect, the mind manifests in the action-oriented faculties. That's called intelligence. Seichel hamaisi, the functional intelligence alone. That's around function. That's the lowest. That's the utter lowest level of intelligence. The same thing is an example for above. He's summing up the chapter here. Same thing is an example above, that the level and also all the 10 spheres are in all the world. You see, he mentions Chachma here because Chachma is mochin. They're not Atzilus Atzmus. In Atzilus is the essence of it, like in the mind. And what extends and drawn into Beriya Yetzirah is only a reflection. It's not the essential light and energy of Atzilus. And this is what defines the gradations of higher and lower in the worlds, of the way that energy is diminished or revealed, or different qualitative states from Atzilus to the lower worlds.
All this is just explaining Chachma.
No. Chachma is only the example of mochin, but he spoke about. Well, the last section is he's explaining mostly how mochin is different in each level. But the truth is, in the beginning of the chapter, was talking about all the 10 spheres, so it's about everything. Yeah. Kitzur, the summary. And the same thing, just like we spoke about the distinction and the division and the device and the diversity of spheres, that each sphere has its own higher and lower hierarchy. The same thing, this structure also exists in the worlds. The essence sphere is the Beriya, the 10 spheres of Beriya are not of the same personality and identity as the 10 spheres of Atzilus, even though they come from there. They speak in a different context, in a different idiom, in a different paradigm. Like our comprehension, that is always has within it some type of image of space. It's not of the same quality of the comprehension above that does not think in context of space. That is not in a level. It's not spatial. Like Atzilus, which is the comprehension of the essence of the divine. And Beriya is the comprehension of the divine through, as he said in Inyan Achad, Dover Achad, through something else. And also the supernal mother, which is binah, as it is nested within Beriya, is not the way it's in Atzilus. Like he said, there was binah that's attached to Chachma in Atzilus, and outside the river separates. And we can say that the intelligence in Beriya, intellect in Beriya, is only as it's related to emotions. And explained explained that the intelligence that is related to emotions is appreciating, contemplating on the goodness of the thing, on the quality, on its value. And higher than that, it's the outer dimension of intelligence, that manifests in kshamas sichle, meaning in the crassness of his physical mind. And that's why it's close to the feeling that it's good for him, meaning subjective value. By contrast, the inner dimension of seichel, intelligence, that's far closer to the feeling of the essence of that divine thing, not that it's about how good it is for you. Well, the Maila Yeser and higher, the comprehension is the divine that is within the worlds, and in general that's called mochin diyanika, the intelligence that is of, he mentioned this, the intelligence of nursing, meaning the level that's still unika, the Yetzira midas, and Yetzira is primarily emotions, and the intelligence there, intellect there, is only to govern the emotions. Asiya maisa v'seichel amaisi. And Asiya is action and intelligence, functional intelligence relevant to actions. So with this we conclude chapter 45. So we did today pages 79 and 80. And we conclude chapter 45 in Discourse 12.